Now the beautiful Victor. I was going to say that it kind of started with this amazing picture, but it didn't really start with that. It started on the 50th anniversary of your father's passing, and the fact that you had never really known much about his life. He died quite young, sadly. He was only 31, I think.
No, he was 40.
Okay.
40, but
right.
40 is young.
Yes. And I know that you got in touch with Cal Brewer Barracks about his time.
His army records, because he served in the army during the emergency period till 1945. Now, it's important to point out that my grandfather's name and my father's name were the same, Samuel Edmonds.
Right.
So when I looked for Samuel Edmonds' military records, they gave me 2 Samuel Edmondses. And I was very surprised to get records from my grandfather for the Civil War, because we didn't know in my immediate family that my grandfather had fought in the Civil War. We knew he'd been in the First World War. He was in the British Army, in the Royal Horse and the Royal Field Artillery, from 18 years of age when he joined up. But he survived 3.5 years on the Western Front and was involved in the Somme and Passchendaele and some of the very big events, and was very, very lucky to survive.
Were these facts that you knew already? Or was it you had a vague notion, or
a very vague notion?
Sorry, Max 1 and Max 2 are down here as well, just in case people are wondering who you're smiling at, because they're nicely settled now. Yeah.
No, I knew nothing about my grandfather's war record, because very like most veterans, he never spoke about it.
Right.
He didn't speak about the Civil War, and he didn't speak about the First World War. They say that veterans only talk to one another, because they know, they understand what they've been through. But I have spent almost 8 years researching and writing my grandfather's story.
Well, it's an incredible story. I'm wondering whether that first original, kind of notice from Cal Brewer Barracks told you of the most incredible coincidence in a life, to be a part of 2 major moments in Irish history. Was that in the records then, or was that something you discovered later? Or?
No, the record that you have on paper basically is medical records and transfers from one barracks to another, but there's no operational information, so it doesn't say where he was or what he was doing. So I got that information from 3 of my father's brothers, who were still alive at that time. And it turns out that one of the brothers actually brought his father back to visit Bale-na-Blah in 1963.
So this is the first of the 2 historic moments that he was actually present.
Yes.
When Michael Collins.
He was in the convoy. He was one of the riflemen in the Crossley tender at Bale-na-Blah. And that's the convoy that went from Portobello the previous few days. And they had been driving around West Cork on various activities with Collins, who was calling to various people and having meetings. The ambush at Bale-na-Blah, Fran.
All right, Max 2. But the ambush,
the ambush was just an ambush, and Collins's death was a complete tragedy caused by his own foolhardy action, whereby the first mistake he made was he told the convoy to stop and countermanded the order of Emmett Dalton, who told the driver of the car they were in to drive like hell. That was his order, and Collins put his hand on the driver's shoulder and said, "No, stop, we'll fight them." And that was it. He then foolishly walked out of cover and started shooting at distant soldiers, and he was shot whilst he was out. And they say it was because he had no practical experience as a soldier. He'd been in the GPO in 1916 working as an aide-de-camp to Count Plunkett, but he hadn't been a fighter. And with his squad and all that during the War of Independence, he was in charge of all the information and giving the orders to have fellas wiped out. But he wasn't doing any of that killing or shooting himself. So he didn't really know what he was up to. Yeah. And an experienced soldier would have been an awful lot more careful.
And of course, his the symbolism of Collins, he is, you know, sort of Che Guevara figure. He's many kind of he's a poster, he's a t-shirt, he's a tattoo. So there's a sense that he, you know, it's hard to accept often within both sides that your heroes might be flawed and that there are moments where mistakes are made.
He was a genius at counterintelligence, and he was a workaholic. Right. He never went to bed leaving work undone. He finished everything every day, and he had a phenomenal rate of work. Now, he was a very good letter writer, and his first job was in the English Post Office in London, and part of that job was writing an enormous number of letters. Right. And that's where that came. Developed from.
Now, we should mention too now, just so in regard to your grandfather Sam, that, you know, that's one historic moment which would you know, haunt your dreams and be part of your psyche for the rest of your life. But then 3 months later, he's part of another crucial moment.
He was on duty in Beggars Bush Barracks, and although there were almost 700 National Army soldiers on duty there, he was picked as one of the 15-man firing squad to execute Erskine Childers. And further than that, the firing squad of 15, only 5 of them had loaded rifles.
Wow.
And the 5 of them were all ex-British Army soldiers.
Right.
And the reason they were given the deed to do was because they were battle hardened.
Right.
There had been an execution in Dublin shortly before Childers of 4 young men, and 3 of them were killed in the volley, but the 4th one had to have a coup de grace, and the officer in charge of that firing squad, young and inexperienced, had some second thoughts, actually thought of getting an ambulance for the guy, but he did finally carry out his duty, but had to give him a shot to the head, which presumably was rather unpleasant for all concerned. Yeah. So they wanted tougher men, but like my grandfather was a driver in charge of 2 horses that towed the cannon, or the howitzer as it was, and like he wasn't an accomplished rifleman.
Right.
But when Childers was executed, he was killed immediately. They had pinned a white cloth to his chest, and the men were told to fire at the white cloth.
I know Childers, I think, has stayed at the Helena Cottage here in Greystones in the past. It was a
no, that was Emmett Dalton.
Oh,
actually.
Okay, right. Oh, there you go. I get my history card.
That would have been the summer of 1943 when people in Greystones rented out their houses to holiday makers for the season.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously Collins was here a few times.
Collins would have stayed in the Grand, and there was another hotel here that he stayed in, and then he was friendly with a family here, a double barrel name family,
of course,
and himself, and then his fiancée Kitty Kiernan came and stayed here.
Right.
And I know, for example, Collins stayed in the Grand Hotel the night before he went over on the mailboat for the treaty negotiations. And there's some information about that because he met a priest at Mass in Greystones that morning who wrote about their meeting. And so there's a connection. Collins, Greystones, my grandfather.
Do you think your own father would have been aware of his father's story? Do you think that was something that would have surprised him too? Or?
I think that my father was the eldest of my grandfather's 8 children. And because he was the eldest, I feel he would have been told more than his younger brothers were told.
Right.
And the 3 brothers who gave me the information were all the same opinion, that my grandfather very rarely spoke about it and very rarely gave any detail of either the First World War or the Civil War. And lots of other people, like Sean Lemass, when he was asked about the Civil War, he said, "I'd prefer not to talk about it."
Right.
They wanted to forget about it. Now,
I'm thinking too that obviously the area you think of Kilcool, especially with you know had quite a strong connection with gun running, and there would always be in every society in Ireland at the time, you know, the twos and the fours and the against, and the sense of you know, divided country at times. I don't know whether you're over the 8 years of research that it made you kind of a little bit sad about the fact that there was so much kind of unnecessary pain and fighting and hatred, or whether you were, I don't know, if there was hope in it. Or
the big pity about it is Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, because they were based on the anti-treaty and the pro-treaty people, although Fianna Fáil wasn't founded till I think 1926. And you have the most peculiar situation of a civil war anywhere, where the defeated side, the anti-treaty side, De Valera's side, after a number of years in 1932 were re-elected into power. And like one of the first things they did was they brought in new pension rules for the Civil War and for IRA activity, so that people who killed Irish people against fighting for the anti-treaty side were now rewarded financially. Which to me, that's the one thing that would like a fella like Ernie O'Malley, who lived on a very nice pension, was out there killing soldiers from the Free State Army and making no apology for it, thinking that he was doing that for the freedom of Ireland.
Right,
and they all wanted for the you know, a 32 county republic. This is what they were doing it for, and they were never ever going to get that, and they weren't realistic enough to realise that. And today the situation we have with the 6 counties is probably nearer to being resolved because of Brexit rather than all the trouble and strife that went on over the years.
And Ernie O'Malley, should I know him, or is that just a generic name?
Oh no, he is a very well known. He's famous because he was a very senior officer in the anti-treaty, well, in the IRA, and then took the anti-treaty side. But he wrote a number of books, and the books were very well thought of because he went into a lot of detail, and then he interviewed a lot of the participants in the Civil War. And his diary records are in UCD archives, where I've been to.
I should have known that, but I was sick
to root around.
I was sick today. We did history in school, so I missed all that.
Well, can I say to you that his handwriting is atrocious, and when
Was
you're
he a
when you're trying to read, well, he was a medical student.
Oh, well, that
actually,
that would have influenced his handwriting a lot.
Yes, and it's very difficult to read. But like, he did an interview with Dulcibella Barton, Robert Barton's sister, when she was in her 70s, and she, in that interview, told the story of when Childers and Robinson were arrested that morning in Glendalough, that they were brought by sidecar to Wicklow Gaol, or Wicklow Jail. Yeah. Now, a sidecar is the horse and cart that you have in The Quiet Man with Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne sitting sideways. So it's a horse and cart, you know, with a driver. And she said at that time, when she was being interviewed by Ernie O'Malley, that she didn't believe that Childers would reach Wicklow without being killed. They were that afraid, and Childers was a hated figure by the National Army people. But they took him to Wicklow Jail. He was only kept there for a number of hours, and he was then taken by, and Robinson, taken by car to Portobello. Now, in Wicklow Gaol, they have a big display of the story of Childers, and they say he was there for 3 days and 3 nights, but he wasn't.
In spirit, maybe.
This is not you can check the local Wicklow newspapers, where I got all that information from, that he was only there till midday.
Was that something over those 8 years? That must have been something I'm sure you hit again and again, that you just realise that the popular notion is actually quite wrong, because, you know, people like to print the myth.
That's
as opposed
right.
to the facts can often be a little bit
There's
dull.
A huge amount of misinformation out there. If you go back to the fact that my grandfather was in the convoy, there's at least 4 people claimed to be in the convoy, who
I
certainly
think Donald
weren't
Trump said
there.
he was there, wasn't he?
Well, this is it. That
He was the greatest soldier that Ireland ever had.
you know, there was
the bestest.
the one I can remember. Andy Caverly was referred to as the last surviving member of Collins's convoy living in America, and I checked up Andy Caverly, and the military records are there. The Army Census of 1922 gives the details of when he joined the army, and he joined in October, so he couldn't have been at Bale na Bláth in August.
Maybe having a picnic in a field just nearby and felt, well, that's good enough for
and
me.
said, here, I'll
I'm
say
part
I
of
was
history
there.
now. Well, there is that. I think obviously there is that kind of human want to be sort of have a hero story connected to either yourself or to your family or to people, but to have what you discovered to be two crucial. I just find that kind of so mind-boggling, and I don't know whether you're still
I was
kind of a bit
bowled over, because my grandfather to me was an ordinary man,
right.
and like, I was 18 when he died, so I knew him quite well. All his grandchildren loved him, and he had a lot of grandchildren, and he was pleasant. He liked his pint of Guinness, his bottle of stout is what they called it.
Very different.
He smoked his woodbine. He never had a car, he had a bicycle, and he worked as a builder's labourer, painting and decorating, stuff like that. And when I discovered this stuff about him, you could have knocked me down with a feather. It's so regretful that I haven't, well, nobody really had the opportunity to question him.
Right, just to
and
get
he drank pints of porter, pints of beer with Michael Collins.
Yeah.
You know, he was there with all those other very famous characters of the period.
Yeah.
So unfortunately,
as you said at the start, to that feeling that people, just they don't want to talk about this, and they feel that it's a very private thing, and they feel like others who've been.
The time has come around now, I think, but it's the point you asked me about. What do I feel about it? I feel that De Valera was responsible in a huge way for the Civil War, and then he had this thumb down on Michael Collins's memory to try and stop his family from putting up a proper gravestone in Glasnevin. And then the other thing about De Valera is the way he converted money that he had collected in America to found the Irish Press, and gave the ownership of the Irish Press to his own family, and to this day they're still earning money from it. And that's what they call the dubious conversion of the Irish funds, which Irish Americans gave for Irish freedom, not to feather the nest. Of the
I think as time goes on, we're always kind of suspicious of even charities. You sort of feel there's Mayor Quimby's and characters like that in the woodwork, who are basically using a good cause and a noble cause for their own personal kind of financial gain.
And of course we have De Valera's connection to Greystones as well. That his wife and children.
We have a great shot of him down in Killian's Hall, actually, and I know there was a welcoming party in Delgany, and lots of now we should mention the fact that you spent 8 years, you wrote a book, and you really have put a huge amount of research into it, a huge amount of time, which is rare enough because it's an industry in itself. Books on the 1916 Rising.
That's right, yes.
And it's almost just people remixing the same song just to make a quick buck at anniversary times and all that. But this I would imagine is what they call a labour of love, really.
It is, yes.
A labour of family love, really.
It's a most unusual story, because I reckon my grandfather was the only National Army soldier who was present and on duty at the deaths of Michael Collins and Erskine Childers. So that's a unique angle to the story.
Well, we're hoping now. We should say that the title there now, which we will have anyway, is Two Deaths in 22. Yeah. Now we'll obviously put this out there. I do think that there's a unique angle on a fresh look at what is a huge part of Irish history, and I think the more we understand about these things, the better forward.
That's right, and we're coming up to the 100th anniversary, in 22.
Right.
So hopefully, I've had 2 rejections, unfortunately, so far.
I get rejected every day, don't I? It's just part of life, I'm afraid. Once you're a writer, that's it.
But I'm working on a third. I'm working on a third submission.
Well, we wish you the best of luck with it. We'll keep an eye on that, and certainly this hopefully will make people a little bit more aware of the story, and also the fact that you have, you know, dedicated 8 years to telling it properly, as opposed to just making a t-shirt or making it into something to just say at dinner parties.
Very good.